Welcome back to an acquired taste. For 8 years, I worked for a family with a growing portfolio of small companies. On their behalf, I started a company, turned around their biggest company, or at least helped to turn around their biggest company, and I grew a few more while I was there. It was like being a company founder with someone else's money and considerably less risk for me professionally or personally. Some people would call it entrepreneurship. I don't really love that term. That's a story for another day. But this was a great gig. I was growing as a professional. I had incredible opportunities. I became extremely close personally with the family. I went to Thanksgiving dinners. I went to weddings. I even visited people when they got sick in the hospital. Felt a lot more like family than it felt like employers. And I loved it. The companies in the portfolio were doing well. We had started 2 new companies that were growing quickly. They were already profitable. Total portfolio company value, like revenues that were being generated, were north of $100 million. And most of the companies were continuing to scale, and some were doing that very quickly. And I was directly benefiting from this. Make no mistake. They sent me to 2 very expensive, very exclusive education programs, executive ed, certification programs at 2 different Ivy League schools. It was a phenomenal opportunity. But then on a fairly random day in early fall, I was called to a meeting. I sat at kind of a nondescript wooden table across from the chief executive of the company, my boss, and watched as he slid a stack of papers in front of me. I could tell pretty much immediately from the look in his eye I was about to be fired. Honestly, at that point, everything went a little blurry. I don't really remember what was said. I only remember the dimly lit room, that cheap wooden table, and this creeping dread of how I was going to tell my wife I just got fired. We called it a mutual decision. That seemed nice. That seemed respectful. And I was offered a severance package that was fair, or at least probably fair. I didn't negotiate anything in that package, and I didn't ask any questions. Somehow in the back of my head, I knew this was coming, and I probably knew that for months. A recent dust up I had with another senior executive, one of several kind of run-ins I had with this person, was likely the final straw. I made it very clear I didn't want to work with this person anymore, and I also shared my belief that they weren't the right kind of person to be a leader in the company. Ultimately, you could say they chose him over me. I worked out my notice for 2 weeks, and I even closed a monster deal on the very last day I worked there, which some might say was dumb because I was never going to personally benefit from that deal. But it was, to me, my mic drop moment where I was going to magnify the huge mistake they made in letting me go. How would they ever replace me and all of my talent? No one from the family said goodbye on my last day. They didn't even acknowledge I was leaving forever. And that made me very sad. I felt like I had made them a lot of money, did everything that was asked of me. I seldom complained. Now here I am, this persona non grata, and to me it felt like they didn't care enough to even say goodbye. After leaving, I had time to reflect, obviously, a lot more time on my hands. And I reflected on everything, and a couple of things started to become very clear to me. So here are the 6 things I learned when I got fired that I think any ambitious professional will find useful. Don't make these mistakes, or at least acknowledge this is happening to you. So let's jump in. Number 1, anyone is replaceable. Doesn't matter how much money you make someone or how effective you've been in the past. That is prologue. Every organization can find someone or something to replace you. Number two, I dramatically estimated my value to the company. Dramatically overestimated my value to the company. On paper, pretty easy mistake to make. My cost as an employee was a fraction of the revenue and value that was being generated from the work that I did and my team and the portfolio companies that I directly managed. But see above, everyone is replaceable. When I made them choose between me and the person I couldn't stand to work with anymore, they chose him. They picked him over me. Number three, my work wasn't as good as it once was. I was doing my job, I was meeting expectations, but increasingly, I was never exceeding expectations. I was doing what I had to do. I wouldn't say I was doing the bare minimum, but probably just barely above the bare minimum. Number four, I wasn't recognizing my own frustration with how I was advancing in the company, my professional progression, if you will. I knew my name would never be on the door, or at least the figurative door, and I could live with that, but I felt my contributions weren't being rewarded. This justified to me, at least in my mind, my next mistake, which was I cut my own discretionary hours. If I could have worked more on something, or I could have worked harder on something, or I could have put in some hours on a weekend, I just didn't. I stopped doing it. I spent too much time worrying about who was getting ahead of me at work, who was conspiring against me, the black helicopters, the tinfoil hats, how I was getting cheated. Pretty dark stuff. Of course, this was self-inflicted. It was unproductive. And frankly, it was probably poorly informed. Was I really getting cheated? I probably wasn't. I probably was being treated fairly. But in my mind, I had made it something else. And so I started sabotaging my own reputation and my own performance by consciously cutting back on that work and on the quality of that work. Number five, I was no longer a fit in the culture. The behaviors, the work, the expectations that got the company to where it was were no longer going to be the things that moved it forward, that moved it beyond. I was a cultural dinosaur. It felt like that happened overnight, but I ignored it. I thought this was just a phase of the company. Maybe things would change. I can survive this. I'd done it in previous companies where similar things had happened, and I just held on, and eventually things got better. But it wasn't, and I was part of an extinction event as that cultural dinosaur that just hadn't happened yet. And finally, number six. And here's the most important thing I learned. Getting fired ended up being the best thing that could have happened to me. I was a great, successful fit for that company for 7.5 years. But by the beginning of year 8, it was time to go. I wasn't happy. They weren't happy with me. I needed to leave. And they just facilitated that departure. It's as simple as that. It took years for me to get over it. I was hurt. I was sad. I was angry. I was disappointed. I was all of those things. But you could say they did me a massive favor by firing me. That was 8 years ago. Had I not been fired, I wouldn't have founded my first company. I wouldn't have started my second one. I wouldn't have started a venture capital fund. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to help, founders build dozens of successful companies, or supported even more entrepreneurs in their journey through the next 8 years. I got to invest. I got to mentor. I got to support founders and entrepreneurs that I never would have had the opportunity to even meet, let alone have that relationship with. And that truly was a blessing. And to be clear, the company and the people I'm referring to weren't the bad guys in this story. I did this to myself. I did as much to sabotage myself as anything that was done to me. I gained a ton of experience. I loved working there for about 85% of the time. And it put me in a position to be more successful after leaving. I would not be where I am today had I not gone through that. And for that, I will always be grateful. I hold no ill will towards the family, towards that company, constantly rooting for their success. Wish them all the best. So my wish for you, I hope you get fired. And what I mean by that is, I hope you learn as much as I did about myself, my opportunities, my shortfalls, how I would do things differently. And I hope that accelerates your growth as a professional as much as it accelerated mine. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you would be so kind, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.